Tiny sports cars have a long and interesting history in the automotive world, dating all the way back to the early days of cars. They seem to come and go in popularity, like we as a species sometimes forget their value. But no doubt the first tiny sports car that started it all and really changed everything has to be the MG Midget. Like most great car companies, MG, or Morris Garages, came from humble beginnings. Morris Garages was essentially a sister company to Morris Motors. One can think of Morris Motors as sort of the Ford of Great Britain in these early days. And Morris Garages was almost like a dealer for Morris Motors. Basically, they sold and serviced and marketed the cars. But everything changed when a charismatic and creative young leader named Cecil Kimber took over Morris Garages and began essentially turning the cars into competitive sporting machines. So if Morris was Ford and Morris Garages was a dealer, then at this point, think of Kimber as kind of like a Carroll Shelby. But these souped-up, rebodied Morris cars weren't just performers, they also had a sleek look to them, and it was clear that Kimber really had an eye for basically everything automotive. Cecil Kimber sadly wouldn't live to see the Midget in its final and most recognizable form, but his keen eye for what the public wanted, both in terms of performance and design, would really live on and certainly influence that later Midget, which, as we'll see, was essentially another rebody of a different car. It was the same kind of thing that he was doing early on. More on that later, though. The Midget's birth dates back to just before the 1929 stock market crash, and then obviously the Great Depression. MG had just become MG, leaving behind the shackles of Morris Motors, and now they were in their own space and they were building their own cars. MG's first model wasn't exactly a runaway success, but this new car from MG, creatively named the Midget by MG for its compact and approachable size, and really an even more approachable price tag, well, this car in many ways actually benefited from the massive economic downturn that would come right after it came out. From the very beginning, that is 1929, the MG Midget embodied the spirit of what we now understand a tiny sports car to be. 20 horsepower wasn't, breaking any necks even at that time, but a 1,279-pound curb weight in a small package coupled with incredibly direct handling, it did what small, unassuming sports cars should always do. From the get-go, made you feel like you were going fast even if you weren't actually going that fast. Motor Magazine points out in an early review of this first MG Midget, they say that the MG Midget fills a real niche in the sports car world and is capable of holding its own with other cars of similar type, whether of British or foreign origin. It is one of the most fascinating little vehicles we've ever driven. The little two-door Midget repped an 850cc inline-4, it had a ladder-type chassis, beam front and rear axles, and all of this would really be the template for MG sports cars going forward. Though the Midget really was the runaway success for the new company, MG still worked to build much larger sports cars to compete with the dominant and expensive Bentleys. For the 1930 Brooklyn's Double 12 Motorsport Festival, both the Midget and the significantly larger and more powerful 18/100 six-cylinder were brought in racing form to see how MG could fare against the best in the world. It was the Midget that shined far more than the big MG6, taking 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th in its class. And this really helped the little car to sell even better. So for 1931's Brooklyn race, Kimber decided to go the extra mile, completely reworking the chassis, and this year the Midget would utterly dominate its class, taking all of the first 5 places. Just a few years later, and after incredible successes in racing of all kinds, a supercharged version of the Midget at the 24-hour of Le Mans and takes 6th place overall. So of all the cars at Le Mans this year, it took 6th. This would be the smallest capacity car to ever place this high at Le Mans. It turns out you didn't need an expensive, giant, hulking 8-cylinder sports car to go fast and have fun. The Midget was teaching the world an important lesson about what it takes to go fast. This car was a literal phenom, and the general public couldn't get enough of it. Through the 1930s, MG proved its racing prowess with models beyond just the Midget, and made a name for itself as really the everyman sports car. The company could trick out its stock models and compete with the likes of not only Bentley but also Alfa Romeo and Maserati. But racing expenses would take a hit on the company, and ultimately Kimber would be forced to sell MG back to Morris Motors in 1935, and the company quickly canceled all racing efforts. But the Midget was still too good for its own good. Even if the company didn't want to make its own race versions, it was now in overhead valve form instead of overhead cam form, and the Midget started to find success in off-road competition thanks to its lightweight but durable form. After World War II, there was an incredible appetite for cars worldwide, but especially in the US, and in Great Britain, there was also a great need to export. MG had always focused primarily on its own home market, but many servicemen, again, primarily from the US, had found a love for the little midget, and once home, with, some cash in their pocket, well, they longed to be back in Great Britain, flying down those country lanes. At this point, there were basically no rivals to the Midget, which at this point was known as the Midget TB, so despite its 33.5% increase in price because of various factors, Americans started importing it, and MG could not make enough of this fast little car. But by 1949, things were changing, and the current version of the Midget was becoming dated, and it wasn't really the engine that was the problem. At this point, it repped a 1275cc version of the overhead valve inline-4, and as odd as it may sound, tiny sports cars aren't really about more and more power. No, it was the handling and it was the suspension that was really becoming dated. So for this year, MG updated the Midget by using a modified version of their Y-type chassis, along with independent coil-sprung front suspension. The ride was significantly more comfortable, but they also added rack and pinion steering, along with new left-hand drive options for the US market. So now the Midget was even more usable, better to drive, and still really affordable. This model was known as the TD Midget, and it would have its final day in TF form in 1955. Sports cars were innovating at incredible rates at this point. Bigger and faster was really the name of the game. Just in Great Britain, you can think of cars like the Austin Healey 100. Even with updating the looks of the Midget, it still just couldn't compete with these new cars. And MG would focus its sporting efforts on other larger, at least for its day, models. All these cars are tiny, looking back. But they started working on cars like the MGA, which is iconic in its own right. And this would be one of those periods where the tiny sports car concept would sort of have a fallout with the general public. Once again, the public were duped into thinking that sporting machines needed to have more than 2,000 cc's of capacity. But the return of the Midget would be even more impressive. By the 1960s, about 40% of the British car market was owned by BMC, or British Motor Corporation, and that included companies like MG and Austin Healey. MG wanted to re-enter the tiny sports car market with something affordable, so they turned to fellow BMC manufacturer Austin Healey, really the foremost sports car company in Great Britain at this point, and they turned to them to basically help them. See, Austin Healey had a little sports car known as the Sprite. This was a different kind of sports car than the earlier Midget, with the main difference really being that it was unitary construction or unibody construction, or almost unibody construction. Basically, the frame and body on this car are not separate, but one. This was a brilliant little car, with the fun factor really taken to a new level over the old Midget. You literally sat inches off of the ground, and you could roar around the streets like you were Sterling Moss, flying through the gears at what felt like breakneck speeds, when in reality the little 948 inline-4 made about 40 horsepower on a good day, and did 0 to 60 in over 20 seconds. The first Austin Healey Sprite was a car that you could push to the very limit without hardly even breaking the speed limit. And it was a massive success in his own right. This first version of the Sprite had taken on the name Frog Eye or Bug Eye Sprite due to its unique headlight setup. This was kind of just what people were calling it. Now, the Bug Eye Sprite wasn't perfect though, and it's through this partnership with MG to build a new version of the little car, that is the Sprite Midget or, Spridget. Many of the Sprite's flaws would be fixed to make the tiny sports car once again a worldwide phenomenon in a way that it really had never been prior to this. Together, Healey and MG would take the Sprite and just barely tweak it to make it better. Of course, the biggest change was the front-end styling. Now the car just wasn't so goofy looking. It looked like a proper British sports car, like the MGA series or, the Healey 100s. Arguably better looking though, in my opinion. They also added a rear trunk, Weight was up a bit because of these body changes, so they changed the camshaft, adding twin SU carbs instead of the single carb on the Sprite, and they got the power up to about 46 horsepower. In 1961, the new Midget Sprite combo, which was virtually the exact same car minus some chrome features on the body, well, they were released to pretty much universal acclaim. This was one of the best looking and certainly cheapest sports cars you could get. It was a tiny sports car for the masses, and it wasn't so goofy like the old Sprite. It was just as fun, and you could actually take it places now that it had a normal trunk that you could actually get to. Now, I haven't mentioned this yet, but I actually own a Mark I Midget from '62. Long story short, it was sitting in a barn about 5 hours from me, not running. The tires were actually date coded to '67. So yeah, it hadn't run in a very long time, and in a few days I got the engine unstuck, and it was running, though very poorly. Now, I really don't know what I'm doing with cars, and I learned a lot working on this car, and I wouldn't have been able to do a project like this without YouTube, but now it runs and it drives, and it's an absolute hoot. It's not done yet, but it does drive. More about that car at the end of the video. I just wanted you guys to know at this point in the video that we're at the point in the video talking about the generation of the Midget that I actually do have a little bit of experience with. Over time, the Midget would evolve. The first version retained that 948 engine from the earlier Sprite, but in '62, at some point, the engine would go up to 1098. Power was up to 56 horsepower, and 0 to 60 was about 17 seconds, so, not as embarrassing. The Mark II Midget of the mid-60s had roll-up windows, power would be up to about 60 horsepower, and the 0 to 60 got to the point where it was under 15 seconds. And the car just kept getting peppier through the years. Some would say the sweet spot would be the 1275, and especially the few years where it featured round wheel arches. Most agree that once the Midget ballooned beyond that to 1500 cc's in '74, that really the engine was no longer matching the car itself and its character. It was getting too heavy and just didn't have that sort of go-kart feel that it did before. MG's cars would be plagued by safety and emissions regulations. They got heavier, they got uglier, and ultimately, the MG Midget would no longer be regarded as a serious sports car by the end of the '70s. I mean, how serious was it ever? But yeah, 1980 would mark the end of the Midget and really the end of the British sports car era as a whole. Perhaps even sadder, this was the end of the tiny sports car era, especially the tiny affordable sports car for the masses. There were other cars, like the first generation Lotus Elan, but the Midget really was the pinnacle of really what small, approachable sports cars should be. Fun and more fun. And really fun done right. Really a sports car that anybody can aspire to own and anybody can drive and feel like they're really driving a sports car. Now, if I mention to you concepts like affordable sports car or approachable sports car or tiny sports car, and let's say you're under the age of 40, there's a good chance you'll think of one car, and that's the Mazda Miata. But what you might not know is that the very inspiration for the Miata dates all the way back to 1976, when a journalist from Motor Trend named Bob Hall met with the heads of research and development at Mazda, and he rambled on to them about the need for what he called a simple, bugs in the teeth, wind in the hair, classically styled British sports car. Now fast forward just a few years, Bob Hall was actually working for Mazda, and those higher-ups, who at this point were now even higher up at Mazda, well, they couldn't forget that initial conversation about making essentially a British sports car. Now by this time in the 80s, the British Roadster was dead, with cars like the Midget and the MGB and the Triumph TR6 and the Triumph Spitfire. They'd all ceased production. So they approached Bob to start working on a new project, and that project would be the Miata, and it would be influenced primarily by cars like the MG Midget, a small, unibody, fun, rear-wheel drive, front-engine, top-down roadster that was meant for the masses. That's the Miata, and it's stayed true to that identity since its inception. But that formula is the MG Midget formula. There's no Mazda Miata without cars like the MG Midget. All the things that make a Miata great in its day and in today are the things that made the Midget great, dating all the way back to its inception at the end of the 1920s. Now, the Miata is widely regarded as the greatest sports car in the world, and of course I know many of you will scoff at that, and that's fine. And can we really argue against Porsche at this point? Probably not. We all have different opinions on what makes a great sports car. Affordability isn't always at the top of the list for everybody, but what good is an incredible sports car that nobody can get their hands on? For me, a good sporting production machine, whether it's a car or a motorcycle, is one that can still be used to at least most of its potential on the road. 1,000 horsepower really isn't that much more fun than 200 horsepower. In fact, I think it's less fun. And there's really this fine line of affordability and usability coupled with the right amount of power, the right amount of features in a package that we can attain because it doesn't cost as much as a house. Today, budding racers really who are on a budget and those who just want to have fun and try to learn their way around a track, they turn to cars like the Miata and the Midget still, as they're affordable, they're excellent for customization, they're great platforms to learn how to work on them, and they're great on the track still. They epitomize what sports cars should be about: weight reduction over horsepower and handling really above everything else. Now, I haven't owned a Porsche or a Ferrari or a Lotus, and I probably never will, but I have driven my Mark I Midget just around town, and I can concur, it's a hell of a lot of fun. I mean, how many cars are there out there that you feel like you can push it to the absolute limit through all the gears, all under 40 miles an hour? It's just a different kind of fun. And if fun isn't the point of a sports car, I don't know what is. And the MG Midget has always been all about fun. All right, guys, hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching. And if you like car stories, check out my other videos. And yeah, we'll see you guys in the next one.